The storm didn't kill them. Not yet. But the snow was rising, and 2 sets of footprints led across the plains, small, dragging, desperate. Emily held her little brother's hand as tight as she could. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. He hadn't spoken in 1. The wind howled like a dying beast, and the world was just white, endless white, until they saw it. A shack, a flag, smoke, and behind the door, a man with eyes like winter steel and hands that once held a rifle in a war. Nobody talks about anymore. He didn't want them there. Not at first. But something in the girl's eyes, maybe hope, maybe fire, made him leave the door open. What would you have done if 2 frozen kids showed up at your door in the middle of a blizzard? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories of survival, redemption, and found family speak to you, stick around. There's more coming down this dusty road. Mudzent. The wind had teeth that winter. It bit deep into the endless white expanse of the Nebraska prairie, sculpting drifts like sleeping giants against the pale, unforgiving sky. Nothing moved out there, it seemed, save for the ceaseless howl that scoured the land, and 2 small figures fighting their way through the deepening snow. Emily, barely 12, but carrying the weight of years in her eyes, held tight to her little brother's mittened hand. Tom, only 8, stumbled beside her, his breathing shallow, puffs of white vapor barely visible against the frozen air. Behind them, somewhere back along the trail, obscured now by the relentless snowfall, lay 2 fresh mounds of stones beneath a skeletal cottonwood, crude markers. For a mother and father the prairie fever had claimed. Their wagon, a vessel of hope that had carried them west, sat abandoned, its wheel shattered, its meager supplies long gone. Hope, it seemed, had frozen solid, just like the creek beds they occasionally crossed. Emily clutched a small, cold tin box inside her worn coat. It held a linen handkerchief embroidered with forget-me-nots, her mother's careful stitches, and a faded photograph of 4 faces smiling into a future that would never arrive. It was all that was left, tangible memory against the vast, erasing emptiness. Tom coughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at Emily's heart. His lips, she noticed with a stab of fear, were tinged with blue. The fever, barely a whisper that morning, was tightening its grip. They'd been walking since dawn, following the faint ruts of a mail trail, the only sign of human passage in this desolate land. Despair had begun to gnaw, cold and sharp as the wind itself, when Emily saw it, a smudge against the white, a structure, squinting against the stinging snow. She made out the low, dark shape of a building, rough-hewn timber, hunched against the blizzard, smoke curling thinly from a stone chimney. A stage stop, a mail station, whatever it was, it looked solid, real. Maybe, just maybe, it was shelter, a last refuge before the cold claimed them. 2, it was Mac McDonald's place, had been for more years than most folks could recall, a lone outpost in the middle of nowhere, serving the overland stage and the Pony Express riders who dared the route. Mac himself was as weathered and solitary as the station he kept, a veteran of the war between the states, they said, though he never spoke of it. He lived alone, save for an old, grizzled hound named Buck, who seemed to mirror his master's taciturn nature. Mac kept to himself. His world shrunk to the delivery of mailbags, the tending of his fire, and the quiet company of his dog and his memories. As Emily pushed open the heavy plank door, a wave of blessedly warm, wood smoke-scented air washed over them. The room was small, dominated by a pot-bellied stove radiating heat. Rough shelves lined one wall, holding dusty ledgers and tins. On the opposite wall, tacked over peeling whitewash, was a large, brittle map of the territories, crisscrossed with faded lines marking trails and rivers. It was covered in small, precise marks, little red crosses and circles, drawn along the winding routes. Mac MacDonald looked up from where he sat, hunched over a cup of steaming coffee. He was broad-shouldered, but stooped, his face a roadmap of lines etched by sun, wind, and sorrow. Suspicion narrowed his pale blue eyes as he took in the two shivering children huddled just inside his door. Snow melted from their ragged coats, puddling on the worn floorboards. "What you want?" His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Dissociate, maybe, or just a permanent edge of impatience. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "Shelter, sir. Just for a bit." "My brother, he's poorly." Mac's gaze flickered over Tom, who swayed on his feet, leaning heavily against Emily. He saw the feverish glaze in the boy's eyes, the bluish tint to his lips, a flicker of something unreadable. Pain, recognition, crossed the old man's face before the shutter came down again. He looked away, towards the map on the wall, his jaw tight. Children meant trouble, meant noise, meant remembering. Remembering a small grave on a hillside far from here, marked with the name of a son the war had taken indirectly, stealing his future long after the cannons fell silent. "Ain't no place for young'uns here," he growled, turning back. "Stage ain't due for 2 days. Best be moving on." Emily flinched, but stood her ground. Where could they move on to? The prairie outside was a death sentence. "Please, sir, he's burning up. We lost our folks back down the trail. The fever." Her voice cracked. Just then, Tom's legs gave way. He crumpled silently onto the floorboards, a small heap of wet wool and misery. Buck, the old hound lying near the stove, lifted his head and gave a soft whine, thumping his tail once against the floor. That seemed to decide it. With a grunt that sounded torn from deep inside, Mac pushed himself slowly to his feet. He didn't offer help, didn't speak a word of comfort, but he didn't turn them out either. He motioned towards a narrow cot against the far wall, piled with rough blankets. Put him there. Emily, relief flooding her so intensely she felt weak, managed to drag and carry Tom to the cot. Mac watched them, his expression unreadable. He went to the stove, added another log. The crackle and spit of the fire suddenly loud in the charged silence. He fetched a tin cup, filled it with water from a bucket, and stirred in some kind of powder from a small pouch. He handed it wordlessly to Emily. "Get that in him if you can." He turned away, busying himself with sorting a pile of mail sacks, deliberately creating distance. Emily knelt beside the cot, coaxing Tom to drink. He swallowed weakly, his eyes half closed. She pulled the rough blankets tighter around him, her hand lingering on his hot forehead. She looked over at the old man's broad, forbidding back. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he heard or cared. Her own eyes, dry until now, felt hot. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of him. She had to be strong for Tom. Later, as the light outside faded from gray to bruised purple, Emily's gaze kept returning to the map on the wall. The firelight flickered across its surface, highlighting the red marks. Curiosity, a small spark in the midst of her fear and exhaustion, prompted her to speak again. "Sir, those marks on your map, what do they mean?" Mac glanced over, his expression still guarded. He seemed about to grunt another dismissal, but something in her quiet persistence, perhaps, or the sheer emptiness of the evening stretching ahead, made him hesitate. He walked slowly over to the map, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Places," he said gruffly, tapping a cluster of marks near the Platte River. "Places I served." He traced a line heading south. "Places I slept on hard ground. Places I fought." His finger paused on a single red cross near a name she couldn't quite read. "Places I lost good men." His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Yet the weight of memory pressed down in the small cabin. He wasn't telling stories. He was reciting ghosts. Each mark, she realized, wasn't just a location. It was a scar on his past. Through his reluctant words, the vast, dangerous world outside these walls seemed to take shape. A place of hardship, duty, and profound loss. A world that had swallowed her parents and left her and Tom adrift. Night fell completely. The wind shrieked around the corners of the station, a lonely counterpoint to Tom's fevered murmurs and the steady crackle of the fire. Mac had given them a chunk of dry bread and some jerky earlier, which Emily had shared with Tom, though he'd barely eaten. Now, the old man sat in his chair, cleaning a rifle, seemingly oblivious to their presence. Yet Emily felt his awareness like a physical thing. She lay down on the floor beside Tom's cot, pulling a thin blanket over herself, the tin box tucked safely inside her coat. Exhaustion pulled at her, but sleep wouldn't come easily. She watched the shadows dance on the rough log walls, listened to the storm outside and the unsettling quiet inside. She was afraid of the fever consuming Tom, afraid of the harsh prairie, afraid of this silent, wounded man who held their immediate fate in his hands. He could still throw them out in the morning. The thought made her shiver, despite the stove's warmth. Closing her eyes, she didn't see the dark cabin. Instead, she saw her mother, sitting by a campfire light years ago. It seemed, her needle flashing as she worked on the very handkerchief Emily now treasured. Her mother's face, illuminated by the gentle glow, was smiling. Warmth, safety, love. It flooded Emily with an aching grief. A sob rose in her throat, thick and painful. She choked it back, biting down hard on her lip until she tasted blood. She couldn't cry, not now. She had to be silent. She had to be strong. She listened to Tom's ragged breathing, the wind's mournful song, and the quiet, steady presence of the old soldier guarding his own solitary post against the long, dark night. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, dictated by the needs of the sick boy and the whims of the relentless winter. Tom's fever clung stubbornly, leaving him weak and listless on the narrow cot. Emily, driven by a fierce, quiet purpose, made herself useful. She learned the quirks of the old stove, coaxing flames from damp kindling, stirring thin broth made from melted snow and the last of Mac's dried meat scraps. She swept the rough floorboards, her small broom whispering against the wood, a sound almost lost beneath the constant moan of the wind outside. Each small task was an offering, a silent plea for continued sanctuary. Night offered a different kind of solitude. Long after Tom had drifted into a restless, fevered sleep, and Mac sat hunched by the stove, lost in thoughts he never shared, Emily would retrieve a nub of charcoal from the hearth, shielded by the cot, in the deepest shadows where the firelight barely reached. She'd pull out a loose floorboard beneath her thin palette. On the rough underside of the wood, she began to write, letters scratched out, dark on dark, recording the passage of days measured in weak soup and dwindling firewood. She wrote of the ache for her mother's smile, the hollow fear for Tom, and the confusing presence of the old man who housed them. He watches. She scratched one night, the charcoal gritty beneath her fingers. Not like Pa watched, proud-like, more like he's waiting for us to vanish, or maybe hoping we won't. A few nights later, she added, he isn't good, not really, and he isn't bad, but Lord, he carries sadness like a second coat. The secret words, pressed into the hidden wood, were the only place she allowed her own frailties to surface. Mac MacDonald kept his distance, a habit ingrained over years of chosen isolation. Yet, he found his eyes drawn to the children more often than he'd admit, even to himself. He watched Emily's small, determined hands tending the fire, saw the way she smoothed Tom's hair back from his hot forehead with a tenderness that echoed painfully in some boarded-up room in his own heart. Sometimes, staring into the licking flames of the pot-bellied stove, the present would blur, and he'd find himself murmuring aloud. Names would surface like driftwood. Miller, Hayes, young Corporal Davies, men who fell beside him at Shiloh or starved at Andersonville. He'd recount fragments of marches, the bite of frost, the sudden, shocking silence after a volley, speaking not to the children, but to the ghosts that shared his hearth. Emily and Tom, tucked under their blankets, would feign sleep, but they listened. Through the veil of fever or the pretense of slumber, they absorbed the fragments of the old soldier's broken past. The war hadn't just scarred the map on his wall. It had left invisible shrapnel deep within him. Alongside losses far more personal than battlefields, they began to understand, in the way children sometimes grasp deep truths, that his gruffness wasn't aimed at them, but at a world that had dealt him too many blows. One afternoon, the snowfall eased momentarily, leaving behind a landscape muffled and deceptively calm. Mac sent Emily out to the woodpile near the lean-to stable for more logs. Tom, restless after days spent indoors, insisted on following. Near the path, hidden beneath a fresh drift, was a treacherous patch of ice clinging to the edge of a shallow drainage ditch. Tom, unsteady on his feet, slipped. He vanished with a startled cry into the soft, suffocating powder. Mac was through the door before Emily could even scream. He moved faster than she'd thought possible, his initial reaction a roar that cracked through the still air. "Boy, you got rocks for a head, wandering off like that." He reached the drift, peering down. Tom looked up, terrified, shivering violently, his face white with more than just cold. Mac's anger seemed to evaporate like mist. The harsh lines on his face softened almost imperceptibly. Without another word, he leaned down, bracing himself, and hauled the boy out of the snow. Tom clung to him, burying his wet, cold face against the rough wool of Mac's coat. Grunting with the effort, Mac swung Tom onto his back. He was heavier than he looked. Mac straightened slowly, his own back protesting, but his steps were surprisingly sure as he carried the shivering boy back towards the warmth of the station. Emily hurried alongside, her heart pounding. It was the first time she'd seen Tom cling to anyone since their father, and perhaps the first time Mac had allowed himself to feel the uncomplicated weight of another human being depending on him. As he set Tom down gently near the stove, unwrapping the wet outer clothes, Mac met Emily's wide gaze for just a fleeting second. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw a flicker of something new. Confusion, maybe, or the startling realization that being needed didn't have to feel like a trap. Later, as the early dusk began to paint the snowy landscape in hues of lavender and gray, Emily sat by the single window, the dim light catching the careful movements of her hands. She was folding small squares of paper, scraps from old ledgers Mac hadn't yet burned. "What's that you're doing?" Mac asked, his voice low. He was cleaning the soot from a lamp chimney, his movements methodical. Emily looked up, holding up a delicate, angular shape, paper cranes. "Mama taught me. She said, if you fold 100, hope doesn't leave you, even when things are bad." She carefully placed the finished crane beside a small row on the windowsill. Mac squinted at the growing collection. Hundreds, a powerful lot. A small smile touched Emily's lips. The first genuine one Mac had seen. "I've made 47 so far," she said softly, her gaze drifting towards him, then quickly away. I reckon maybe you're the 48th crane. Mr. MacDonald." He stopped polishing the glass, his hands suddenly still. He didn't understand what she meant. Not exactly, but the quiet sincerity in her voice resonated somewhere deep inside him. a place long silent. He cleared his throat and went back to his lamp, scrubbing harder than necessary. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the children's presence began to wear away at the edges of his solitude. Emily patched a torn mail sack with careful, small stitches that reminded him painfully of his wife's handiwork. She built a tiny, makeshift altar in a quiet corner, placing the tin box with her mother's handkerchief and the faded family photo upon it. A quiet assertion of memory and love in the midst of his stark domain. She never pressed him, never pried, but sometimes, when he found himself talking to the ghosts in the fire, he'd realize she was sitting nearby, simply listening. Her quiet presence a strange sort of anchor. The discovery happened on a day Tom seemed a little stronger, restless. Emily had explored the small loft space above the main room, pushing aside dusty crates and old tack. Tucked away in a dark corner, beneath a stiff, folded cavalry blanket, she found them, a small, well-loved teddy bear with one button eye missing, and a child's woolen cap, faded blue. She brought them down. Holding them out tentatively, Mac froze. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, shocking flare of anger, raw and painful. He snatched the items from her hand as if they burned him. "Leave things be," he snarled, his voice tight with emotion he couldn't contain. "That ain't none of your concern." He turned away sharply, clutching the bear and cap, but not before Emily saw the crack in his composure, the undisguised anguish that flashed in his eyes before the walls slammed back into place. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night, long after the children were asleep, or pretending to be, Mac sat by the banked fire. The wind had picked up again, rattling the window panes. In the deep shadows, he rose silently and walked over to Tom's cot. For a long moment, he stood looking down at the sleeping boy. Then, with infinite, hesitant care, he placed the worn teddy bear beside Tom's pillow before retreating back to his chair by the dying embers, where he sat, awake and watchful, until the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. A day later, the rumble of wheels and the jingle of harness announced an arrival. Hank Miller, the mail carrier whose route passed through the station twice a month, pulled his sturdy coach to a halt outside, his face ruddy from the cold. He was older than Mac, perhaps, but his eyes held a warmth Mac's lacked. He swung down, stamping snow from his boots. Hank's gaze took in the scene. Mac, gaunt and watchful, the two children huddled near the stove. The undeniable air of occupancy that had settled over the usually empty station. He didn't ask questions, just nodded slowly, a lifetime of understanding passing between the two men in that single look as he handed over the outgoing mail pouch. As Hank climbed back onto his rig, pulling his collar tighter against the wind that promised another storm, he paused and looked back at Mac, standing silhouetted in the doorway. "Always figured you was alone, 'cause you chose it." "Mac," Hank called out, his voice rough but not unkind. "Startin' to reckon. Though, maybe it's just 'cause you plumb forgot how to open the damn door." He clucked to his horses, and the coach creaked away, leaving Mac standing alone in the doorway. The mail carrier's words hanging heavy in the biting winter air. Hank Miller's words lingered long after the sound of his coach faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. Forgot how to open the damn door. Mac stood there for a spell, the cold seeping into his bones, chewing on the thought like a piece of tough jerky. He'd bolted that door himself, years ago, locked it tight against the pain of loss. Had he truly forgotten how, or just misplaced the key? He shook his head, pushing the thought away, and retreated back into the fragile warmth of the station, securing the heavy plank door against the rising wind. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm, marked by the slow mending of Tom's fever and the lengthening winter nights. Until the night the signal came. Mac saw it first, standing by the frosted window pane, gazing out into the impenetrable darkness. A faint, rhythmic flicker, far off to the east. Once, twice, then again, a lantern signal. Out here, in the dead of winter, with the mail route suspended weeks ago by impassable drifts, an icy prickle, sharp and familiar, traced its way down his spine. It was the old instinct, the one honed on darkened battlefields and lonely picket duty, whispering that something was wrong, deeply wrong. He didn't speak of it to the children, saw no sense in frightening them. But he slept lighter that night, his hand resting near the Colt peacemaker he kept loaded beneath his cot. By morning, the sky was leaden, spitting fine, hard pellets of snow, and the wind was picking up, promising a blizzard by nightfall. And then, they came. 3 riders materialized out of the swirling gray, shapes solidifying slowly against the white emptiness. They were hard-looking men, muffled deep in thick coats and pulled-down hats, their horses showing the strain of hard travel. They reined in before the station, their eyes scanning the building, lingering on the thin curl of smoke from the chimney. One dismounted, his boots crunching on the packed snow. "Howdy," the man called out, his voice slightly muffled by a scarf. "Name's Barton. Me and my partners got caught out. Storm's brewin'. Any chance of shelter? Maybe trade for some hot coffee?" Mac stood framed in the doorway, his face impassive, studying them. They looked like countless drifters, men pushed west by failure or running from trouble. But as the man named Barton pushed back his hat brim slightly, Mac's blood ran cold. He recognized the face, scar above the left eyebrow, eyes set a little too close together. Jedediah Crow, wanted in 3 territories. Last heard of running with a gang that hit the southbound stage near Ogallala the previous spring. They'd killed the driver and wounded the guard. Mac kept his face granite smooth. Years of keeping his own counsel served him now. "Storm's comin' all right," he grunted, his voice deliberately rough. "Got coffee? Not much else." He stepped back slightly, a grudging invitation, but before he let them cross the threshold, he turned, his movements quick and low. "Emily, Tom, down cellar, now." His voice was a harsh whisper, leaving no room for argument. "Coal cellar, backside. Stay down, stay quiet, don't make a sound. You hear? No matter what happens up here. Not a sound." Emily's eyes widened, but she nodded instantly. Understanding the unspoken urgency, she grabbed Tom's hand. He was still pale and weak, the fever lingering, and pulled him towards the heavy trapdoor near the back wall. Tom looked scared, his dark eyes like 2 frightened coals in his small face, but he went without protest. Mac watched them disappear into the cold darkness below, then carefully replaced the heavy door, kicking a stray rug over its edges. Only then did he turn back to the waiting men, gesturing them inside with a curt nod. The 3 men stomped snow from their boots, their eyes sweeping the small, warm space, taking in the stove, the sparse furnishings, the map on the wall. They huddled near the fire, accepting mugs of scalding coffee from Mac with mumbled thanks. Barton, Crow, did the talking. Casual questions that felt anything but, "Quiet out here this time o' year. I reckon." "Quiet enough," Mac replied, leaning against the rough counter, his hand inches from where the spare Colt was secured underneath. "Mail runnin' regular?" another man asked, warming his hands around his mug. "Suspended. Snow's too deep. Seen anyone pass through lately?" Crow pressed, his gaze sharp. "Maybe headin' west." "Nobody," Mac said flatly. "Just the wind." Below, in the damp, cold dark of the cellar, Emily held Tom close. She could hear the muffled voices above, the scrape of boots on the floorboards. The air up there felt stretched thin, brittle, like ice about to crack. She could feel the tension through the thick timbers, knew instinctively that Mac was in danger, that they were in danger, If something happened to him. The thought was a cold fist clenching in her stomach. They'd have nowhere left to run. The prairie would swallow them whole. Her gaze fell on the rough inner door at the back of the small cellar space, barely visible in the gloom. It led to a small, unused storage niche where Buck, the old hound, was often loosely tethered to keep him out from underfoot. An idea sparked, desperate and dangerous. She looked at Tom, huddled against her, shivering slightly. Then, moving with infinite slowness, she reached over and fumbled with the simple wooden latch on Buck's door. She leaned close to the crack, her lips almost touching the rough wood. "Buck," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl filtering down from outside. "Sick 'em, Buck." It was a command her father used sometimes. Playing fetch. She prayed the dog understood the urgency in her tone now. Seconds later, chaos erupted above. A sudden, furious barking, the scrape of a chair falling over, a man's startled curse. Emily heard a sharp command. Mac's voice, followed instantly by the deafening roar of a gunshot inside the cabin. Then, a heavy thud, more shouting, terror overriding Mac's strict command. Tom scrambled out from Emily's arms and pushed at the trapdoor, shoving it open a crack just as the commotion reached its peak. He saw Buck, a gray fury, latched onto the arm of one of the strangers, while Mac held his Colt steady on the other two. One had his hands raised high. The third, Crow, was making a desperate scramble for the door. "Tom, get down!" Mac roared, his attention momentarily fractured. "Stick with your sister. Get down." Sobbing with fear, Tom tried to duck back down, stumbled on the cellar steps, and cracked his head sharply against the wooden frame before tumbling back into Emily's arms. Above, Crow burst out the door and vanished into the swirling snow. The man covered by Mac's gun dropped his own weapon sullenly. The third, nursing a bleeding arm where Buck had seized him, cursed violently. Mac, his face grim, disarmed the second man quickly, his movements economical and sure. The immediate danger passed as quickly as it had flared. Mac bound the second man's hands securely, then shoved the injured one, still cursing, towards the storeroom shed outside, locking him in. He ordered Buck, still growling low in his throat, back into the cellar niche. Only then did he turn his attention back to the trapdoor. Emily had pulled Tom deeper into the shadows, cradling his head, whispering reassurances. He was crying softly, more from fright than pain, but she could feel the heat returning to his skin. The cold and terror were coaxing the fever back. Mac knelt by the opening, his face harsh in the flickering lamplight. He looked down at them, huddled together in the dark. For a long, silent moment, his gaze lingered on Tom's pale face, then shifted to Emily's steady, frightened eyes. He saw the faint bruise already forming on Tom's temple. Something shifted in the old soldier's expression, a flicker of weariness, of resignation, maybe something more. He rose slowly, turned away without a word, and went to the old wooden sea chest in the corner, the one that held his few personal belongings. He rummaged inside, emerging with a small, worn tin containing needles and coarse thread. He walked back and sat down heavily on the floor near the cellar opening. Close to Emily, he gestured towards her coat sleeve, torn slightly during the scramble. "Your coat's ripped," he said, his voice gruff, low. "Hand it here." Emily hesitated for only a second, then slipped out of the worn garment and passed it up to him. She watched, silent and wide-eyed, as his large, calloused fingers, surprisingly deft, threaded the needle. He began to stitch the tear, his movements slow, deliberate. Each stitch was tight, uneven perhaps, but strong. He didn't look at her, kept his eyes fixed on his work. The silence in the cabin broken only by the howl of the wind and Tom's quiet sniffles. Later, After the remaining outlaw had been securely tied in the corner, and Tom had swallowed the bitter medicine Mac provided, they ate a meager meal of reheated beans. Mac looked across the small table, his gaze settling first on the boy, now dozing fitfully near the stove, wrapped in blankets, the mended teddy bear beside him. Tom, Mac said, the name sounding slightly unfamiliar on his tongue. Take your medicine. Sleep now. Then he looked at Emily, who was watching the fire. Emily, build up the fire. Needs logs. It was the first time he had called them by their names. Not boy, not girl, not you kids. Tom, Emily. The simple words hung in the air, signifying a change deeper than the settling dust from the earlier violence. That night, after Mac had checked the locks on the door and window shutters, wedging extra timbers against the storm-battered planks, Emily approached him as he stood staring into the replenished flames. The single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. She stood beside him for a moment, small and determined. Then she looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I believe you're a good man. Mr. McDonald, she said softly, her voice clear despite the surrounding quiet. Mac didn't answer. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the fire, on the heart of the flames. After a long pause, he bent down and picked up the last, thickest log from the wood box beside the hearth, a piece of seasoned oak he'd been saving, the kind you kept for the absolute worst night winter could throw at you. He hefted it, then carefully placed it onto the glowing embers. Sparks showered upwards, and the flames leaped, casting a warm, defiant glow against the encroaching darkness and the storm raging outside. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The fragile peace bought by surviving the outlaws shattered before the next dawn. Tom, who had seemed to be rallying, took a turn. The fever, held at bay for days, roared back with terrifying intensity. He thrashed on the narrow cot, his small body burning, his eyes wide and glazed, seeing things only he could see. He cried out, again and again, a single, heartbreaking word. Mama! Mama! Emily felt a cold dread seep into her bones, chilling her more thoroughly than the drafts whistling through the cabin walls. She did everything she knew. She coaxed spoonfuls of thin broth between his cracked lips, broth made from the last scrapings of Mac's dwindling supplies. She soaked rags in cool water from the snowmelt bucket and laid them on his forehead, but they seemed to steam dry almost instantly. She rubbed the last of her precious mint oil onto his chest, hoping the sharp scent might cut through the delirium. Nothing worked. Tom's face was flushed, a frightening crimson, his breathing ragged and shallow. Panic clawed at Emily's throat, but she forced it down. Maintaining a semblance of calm she did not feel. While Mac banked the fire, his face grim, Emily found a scrap of stiff brown wrapping paper and the stub of a pencil Mac used for his ledgers. Huddling near the flickering lamp, shielding the paper from Tom's restless movements, she wrote, her small hand trembling, the letters uneven. To whoever finds this, if Mr. Mac MacDonald does not come back, please take this note to the army post west of here. My brother, Tom, is 8 years old. He is burning with fever. My name is Emily. We lost our folks on the trail. We don't have anywhere else to go, but we still have each other. She folded the paper carefully, her heart aching with a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight. She slipped the note beneath Tom's pillow, a desperate talisman against the unthinkable, a final, fragile anchor cast into a sea of uncertainty. Mac watched her, his own face etched with a deep, weary sorrow. He sat before the stove for a long time, staring into the flames as if seeking an answer in their dance. The firelight carved deep shadows into the lines on his face, making it look like an old, crumpled map of battles fought and lost. Finally, with a sigh that seemed dredged up from the depths of his soul, he pushed himself to his feet. He pulled on his heavy greatcoat, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders. Then, he bent and retrieved something from his sea chest, a strip of white cloth. He knelt and slowly, deliberately, tied the white band firmly around his lower right calf, an old soldier's sign, seldom used, reserved for missions where return was uncertain, a marker for comrades in the chaos of battle. Or perhaps now, a promise to himself. "I'm goin'," he stated, his voice low and rough, devoid of inflection. He didn't look directly at Emily. "Army post. It's 5, maybe 6 miles west. Reckon I can make it if the drifts ain't too bad. Should be back before midnight. If—" He let the sentence hang, unfinished. Emily didn't trust herself to speak. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, white line, her hand tightening its grip on Tom's hot fingers. The weight of the small cabin, the vast prairie outside, and the fragile life beside her seemed to rest entirely on her small shoulders now. Mac pulled his hat low, opened the heavy door, and stepped out into the teeth of the blizzard. The wind tore at him immediately, stinging his face with ice particles, whipping his coat around him like a battle standard. He leaned into it, head down, navigating by instinct through the blinding whiteout. Each step was a struggle, plunging him thigh-deep into the unforgiving snow. The world dissolved into a roaring vortex of white. He pushed on, driven by the image of the sick boy, the silent girl, the ghosts of his past failures urging him forward. Then, the ground simply vanished beneath him. He stumbled, arms flailing, and plunged into a hidden, snow-filled ravine, his head striking a partially buried rock with sickening force. Stars exploded behind his eyes before darkness rushed in. He lay stunned, the icy snow packing around him, the wind howling above like hungry wolves. Blood, warm and sticky, trickled down his neck, melting a small patch of crimson against the white. Disoriented, drifting, the cold seeping into him, the past rose up unbidden. Shiloh, the roar of cannons, the smell of gunpowder and fear, night falling, rain turning the battlefield into a muddy hell. Young Corporal Ellis, barely older than Tom, lying broken in the mud, crying for his mother, just like the boy back at the station. Mac! Then a sergeant, hardened but still human, faced with an impossible choice under withering artillery fire. Try to retrieve Ellis, likely sacrificing more men, or obey the order to fall back, consolidate the line, save the unit. He'd given the order, fall back. They'd retreated, leaving Ellis to the darkness and the enemy. He'd received a commendation for saving his platoon, but from that night on, Mac MacDonald couldn't bear to look himself squarely in the eye in the quiet reflection of a mirror or a still pool of water. The ghost of Ellis was always there, watching, alight, faint at first, then growing stronger, cutting through the swirling snow. Voices, muffled by the wind. Mac blinked, trying to focus. A lantern beam swept over him. Figures emerged from the gloom. Soldiers in heavy winter gear. "Hold up! Over here!" A voice called out. Hands grabbed him, pulling him from the drift. He looked up into the concerned face of a young soldier, bundled against the cold, but with eyes that held a startling mixture of determination and kindness. Eyes, Mac thought fuzzily, that reminded him achingly of his own boy, lost so long ago. "Easy there. Old-timer," the young corporal said. "Took a nasty fall. Name's Jeremiah. We're on patrol from Fort Kearney." Mac couldn't waste time on explanations. His head throbbed. The cold was paralyzing. He fumbled inside his coat, pulling out a folded scrap of paper he'd prepared, pressing it into the soldier's mittened hand. On it, he'd scrawled just 5 words. Child, station, watchers, high fever, urgent. Jeremiah read the note quickly, his expression shifting from concern to understanding. He didn't hesitate. Right. We'll take you. Sergeant, bring the supply sled. We're heading back to the mail station. Double time? He helped Mac towards the waiting sled. Hang on, old man. We'll get you there. Back in the small, lamplit cabin. The storm raged outside, but inside, a different kind of battle was being waged. Emily kept vigil, tending the fire, bathing Tom's face, her movements quiet, almost ritualistic. In the brief moments when Tom seemed settled, she took another square of paper, salvaged from an old tea packet, and folded. Her fingers moved with practiced care, creating sharp creases, shaping the paper into the familiar form of a crane. Crane number 49. Hope. She whispered the names as she worked. A litany against the fear. Number 1. Mama. Number 2. Papa. Number 3. Mr. Mac. She placed the newest crane carefully beside the others, lined up on the rough shelf near Tom's cot. Just a few more, she murmured, more to herself than to the delirious boy. If I make 100, Mama said. You'll get better. Tom, you have to. Hours crawled by. The wind howled. The fire crackled. Then, above the storm, came the sound of muffled shouts, the crunch of boots. The door burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and freezing air. Mac stood there, swaying, supported by Corporal Jeremiah. He was coated in ice, his lips tinged blue, his face deathly pale beneath the bloodstain on his temple. But clutched tightly in his hand was a small, dark bottle, medicine, and a roll of clean linen bandages. He took one step inside and crumpled to his knees on the threshold, utterly spent. But even as he fell, his eyes found Tom, and he reached out. Jeremiah helped him the rest of the way. Mac ignored his own condition, crawling the last few feet to the cot. With trembling hands, he fumbled with the buttons of his own ice-stiffened greatcoat and wrapped it around Tom's small, burning body, pulling him close. He rested his grizzled cheek against the boy's fevered hair, holding him tight, as if afraid the slightest relaxation of his grip would cause the child to melt away like snow in the sun. The next 2 days and night were a blur of anxious waiting, whispered prayers, and carefully administered medicine. Mac, recovering slowly himself, barely left the boy's side. Emily kept the fire fed, melted snow for water, and folded cranes. Then, on the second morning, Tom's eyes fluttered open. He looked around, his gaze unfocused but clear of delirium for the first time. He saw Emily, then Mac, his brow furrowed slightly. "Mama," he whispered, the question hanging plaintively in the quiet room. Then his eyes drifted shut again, but this time, his breathing was even, his body relaxed. It was the deep, healing sleep of recovery. That night, the first truly quiet night since the storm had broken, Mac sat alone before the embers of the fire. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, pristine and silent beneath a sky full of stars. The tied-up outlaw had been handed over to Jeremiah's patrol. The immediate danger was gone. In Mac's large, rough hand, he held a small paper crane. Number 50. Emily must have folded it while he slept. Using a scrap of the bandage wrapping, he turned it over slowly in the firelight. On its delicate paper back, written in Emily's careful, slightly shaky pencil script, were just a few small words. "I think you're a good man, and you came back." Mac looked at the words for a long time. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to soften, just a little, in the warm glow of the dying fire. He carefully placed the crane on the mantelpiece, beside the dusty tin box holding Emily's memories, letting it stand there, a fragile testament to hope, resilience, and a door, perhaps, finally creaking open. Winter finally began to lose its grip on the prairie. Slowly, reluctantly, the snow retreated, surrendering patches of sodden brown earth like old bruises revealed. Meltwater trickled in newly formed rivulets, exposing moss-slicked stones and the skeletal remains of last year's grasses pressed flat against the thawing ground. The vast sky seemed to brighten incrementally each day, stretching longer, though the wind still carried a lingering chill, a reminder of the harshness endured. But the real transformation wasn't in the season. It was inside the weathered timber walls of the mail station. The small building, once a bastion of solitude, seemed to breathe now, warmed by more than just the fire in the pot-bellied stove. It was warmed by the quiet presence of 3 souls learning to navigate the landscape of a shared life. Mornings found Emily and Tom working alongside Max, their small hands surprisingly capable. They helped mend the section of fence line brought down by the winter gales, their breath pluming in the crisp air. They turned over the cold soil in the small patch Mac called a garden, planting the onion sets he'd carefully hoarded. They worked together to clear the silt from the shallow well, Mac's strength augmented by their youthful energy. They reorganized the dusty storeroom, stacking burlap sacks, taking inventory of the remaining cornmeal and oats with a seriousness that suggested they were settling in for the long haul. Putting down roots in this unlikely soil, a new ritual began. Each morning, Mac would leave a folded piece of paper beside Emily's bowl of oatmeal. It was his way, gruff and indirect, of teaching her letters. His handwriting was slanted, the ink flow uneven from the old steel-nibbed pen, but the words were steady. The first note simply read, "You are still here. So am I. That is enough." Emily treasured these notes. She kept them carefully folded inside her mother's tin box, tucked on the shelf beside the one-eyed teddy bear that now resided permanently near Tom's cot. Each night, by the fading lamplight, she would trace the letters with her finger, sounding out the words, her quiet recitation a counterpoint to Tom's soft breathing and the distant cry of a coyote. Before sleep claimed her, she'd whisper a small blessing she'd invented, her own prayer sent out into the vast darkness. May every station have a warm fire, and someone waiting inside. One afternoon, the familiar creak of wheels announced Hank Miller's mail coach, navigating the muddy trail now passable with the thaw. Along with letters and supplies, Hank delivered an official-looking envelope addressed to Max. Later, Emily saw him read it, his face betraying nothing. He folded it precisely, tucked it into a drawer amongst old ledgers, and said not a word about its contents. But the air in the cabin felt different afterwards, heavier somehow. Emily didn't know the letter contained notice of his mandatory retirement, that a younger man was scheduled to take over the station come late spring. A quiet dismissal after years of solitary service. That night, after the children were asleep, Mac sat late by the fire. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and, dipping his pen carefully, began to write another letter. This one wasn't for Emily. It was addressed to a niece back east, a woman he hadn't seen in years. In his careful, slanted script, he laid out provisions, asking if, should anything unforeseen happen to him, if things go wrong unexpectedly, was how he phrased it, she would agree to become the legal guardian for 2 orphans named Emily and Tom. He didn't mention his forced retirement or the uncertainty it cast over their fragile sanctuary. He sealed the letter, addressed it, but didn't post it. Instead, he tucked it deep inside the inner pocket of his coat, letting it rest there, a secret promise kept close to his own guarded heart. A few weeks later, a small wagon train, 5 prairie schooners heading west, stopped to water their stock and rest. The wagon master, a burly man with kind eyes, nodded towards Emily and Tom, who were helping Mac stack firewood. "Yours?" he asked Mac casually. Mac didn't hesitate. His gaze met the man's squarely. "Yes," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "Both of them. That's Emily. And the boy's Tom." The words, spoken aloud, felt solid. True. That evening, as they sat down for supper, Emily quietly placed 3 carved wooden cups on the rough table instead of the usual 2 they'd shared with Mac initially. Mac looked up, a questioning glance, expecting company. Emily smiled, a genuine, warm curve of her lips that reached her eyes. "No, Mr. Mac, but there are 3 of us now." The simple statement settled comfortably in the room. Later, Tom proudly announced he'd finished folding crane number 91, his collection growing steadily on the shelf. Emily added, her voice soft but earnest, "Tom says when we get to 100, we're going to make a wish." She paused, looking directly at Mac. "We're going to wish that you get to stay here, at the station, forever?" Mac swallowed, looking down at his plate. He mumbled something about foolish wishes and paper birds. But later that night, long after the cabin was dark and quiet, he sat by the banked embers, a sheet of brittle, yellowed paper on his knee, with fingers made clumsy by age and unfamiliarity. He attempted to follow the remembered pattern of Emily's folds. His first attempt was misshapen, but he persisted. Finally, he produced a somewhat lopsided, but recognizable, paper crane. He took the stub of pencil and carefully marked it. "Naquandatru." Then, moving silently, he crept over to where Emily slept and gently placed his clumsy creation on the windowsill beside her cot, a silent acknowledgement, perhaps even a shared wish. As the days grew warmer and the prairie began to green, Mac led the children up the low rise behind the station, a place scattered with sun-bleached rocks and whispering grasses. It was a place, he told them quietly, where his own son used to play, chasing grasshoppers in the summer sun. He showed Tom the subtle signs of animal trails, how to set a simple snare for a grouse, skills learned long ago in a different life. He taught Emily how to read the clouds, how to feel the shift of the wind on her cheek and know which way the weather was turning. He shared the quiet knowledge of the prairie, piece by piece, weaving their presence into the fabric of the land, into the fabric of his own history. On that grassy slope, overlooking the solitary station, they built a small monument together, not of grand stones, but of carefully chosen rocks, piled one upon the other. Beneath the base, they buried 3 small tokens: the faded photograph of Emily and Tom's smiling parents, a small square cut from the worn fabric of Tom's first coat at the station, and the tarnished brass army medal Mac had kept hidden away in his sea chest for decades. A joining of pasts, a marker for a shared future, grounded in the earth. Finally, the day came when the unmistakable sound of bells and harness echoed down the trail. The first official mail coach of the spring season. Arriving right on schedule, it pulled up in a cloud of dust motes dancing in the bright sunlight. The driver exchanging mailbags and news with Mac. Emily and Tom stood on the porch, watching as the coach pulled away, its bells fading into the distance. Emily turned to Mac, her expression thoughtful. "I think Mama would have liked it here," she said softly, her gaze sweeping over the wide-open land, then settling on his face. "Because you are here, Mr. Mac." Later, as the afternoon sun slanted low, casting long shadows, they sat together on the worn wooden bench outside the station door. Tom, sleepy and content, rested his head on Mac's sturdy thigh. Emily leaned her shoulder companionably against the old soldier's back. Mac reached out, his large, weathered hands gently covering theirs. Emily's small one, Tom's even smaller one. No words were needed. In that simple, quiet touch lay the weight of all that had been lost, and the profound, unexpected grace of all that had been found. The station stood against the vast prairie sky, no longer just a lonely outpost of weathered timber and solitary duty. It was a repository of shared memories, folded paper hopes, and quiet resilience. It was a home, built not of logs alone, but fortified by 3 hearts that had survived the winter. Together, Owerkabwas. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a tear, maybe a memory, I'd love to hear it. What did you think of Emily? Tom, and old Mac, would you have left that door open or closed it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in second chances, stubborn hearts, and families that find each other in the snow, hit that subscribe button. Stay with us. There are more trails to ride and more stories to tell.